The tape is rolling. Chappelle Studios, London. November 15th, 1971. A small control room. Producer Alan Bates leans against the glass, watching. On the other side, Thelonious Monk at the piano, 54 years old, massive frame hunched over the keys. That signature skull cap. Behind him, Art Blakey at the drums, Al McKibben on bass. Old friends, men who've known him for decades. The session has been going for over an hour. Blakey is talking, cajoling. Come on, Monk, play crisscross. You know you want to. Nothing. Monk stares at the piano, silent, motionless. Then, mid-conversation without warning, he launches into it. Fingers hammering the angular intro to crisscross. No acknowledgement of the request, no eye contact, just sound. It's vintage Monk. Percussive, dissonant, perfect. But something in the room feels wrong. Blakey exchanges a glance with McKibben. Bates shifts his weight in the control room. They can all feel it. Something is ending. Here's what no one in that studio knows. This is the last time Thelonious Monk will ever record. Within 2 years, he'll stop playing entirely. A silence that will stretch 11 years until his death in 1982. What was captured on tape that day in London wasn't just an album, it was a threshold. The question no one could answer then, and still can't now, is this. Did Monk know? By late 1971, Thelonious Monk had no record deal. Columbia Records had quietly dropped him from their roster earlier that year. No announcement, no farewell album, no explanation, just silence. This was the label that had put him on the cover of Time magazine in 1964. The label that had sold more Monk albums than anyone else in history. They'd given him 8 years, his longest relationship with any label. His 1963 debut for them, Monk's Dream, became the best-selling album of his entire career. But by the late 60s, the music industry was changing. Jazz was no longer profitable. Rock was king. And Monk, who hadn't written a major new composition in years, was being dismissed as yesterday's news. Critics complained. He was recycling the same repertoire. His saxophonist, Charlie Rouse, wasn't a genius like Coltrane or Rollins. Monk had stopped evolving. They were missing the point entirely. Monk's music had been fully formed by 1947. He saw no need to change it. The rest of the world was still catching up. But Columbia didn't care about that. The contract ended. No renewal offer came. So when Alan Bates, a British producer for Black Lion Records, approached Monk during the Giants of Jazz tour, Monk said yes. The Giants of Jazz was a bebop supergroup. Dizzy Gillespie, Sonny Stitt, Kai Winding, Art Blakey, and Al McKibben. They were touring Europe, 1 day off in London, 1 studio session. Bates didn't know it would be historic. He just wanted to capture Monk while he still could. That phrase, while he still could, would turn out to mean something he never intended. The Giants of Jazz tour was supposed to be a victory lap. Promoter George Wine had assembled the group after a riot at the 1971 Newport Jazz Festival forced him to cancel the event. To recoup losses, he sent 6 bebop legends on a worldwide tour. Europe, Australia, then back to the States. For Thelonious Monk, it was a chance to perform again after months of dwindling bookings. But something was off from the beginning. Bassist Al McKibben, who had known Monk for over 20 years, later described the tour in stark terms. On that tour, Monk said about 2 words. I mean literally maybe 2 words. He didn't say good morning, good night, what time, nothing. 2 words. In months, Monk would sit silently on the bus. Barely acknowledge anyone. During performances, he'd often play only during his features, then retreat into himself. The other musicians tried jokes, conversation, anything to reach him. Nothing worked. McKibben added with dark humor. He sent word back after the tour was over that the reason he couldn't communicate or play was that Art Blakey and I were so ugly. Classic Monk. A joke wrapped in isolation. But underneath it, something was fracturing. This wasn't new. Monk had been dealing with mental health struggles for decades. Episodes of mania where he'd be awake for days, composing furiously. Then he'd crash, withdrawing into silence that could last weeks. In the late 1950s, a doctor had prescribed him Thorazine, a powerful antipsychotic, along with vitamin shots that secretly contained amphetamines. The combination worsened everything. His behavior became more erratic, his silences deeper. By 1971, Monk was exhausted, physically, mentally, spiritually. And yet, on November 15th, he walked into Chappelle's studios. Why? The session was intimate. Just Monk, Blakey, and McKibben. A small invited audience watching from the control room. Alan Bates had a plan. Capture Monk in trio format, something he hadn't done in 15 years, and get some solo piano performances. Simple in theory, but nothing with Monk was simple. Blakey pushed. He always pushed. That was their relationship. Blakey's aggressive, propulsive drumming driving Monk forward. Fire meeting fire. But that day the dynamic felt different. Bates later recalled the strange rhythm of the session. Blakey would request a tune. Monk, play crisscross. Silence. An hour would pass. 90 minutes. Then Monk would interrupt a completely different conversation and just start playing. No warning, no acknowledgement. Crisscross came out that way. Monk mid-sentence with someone, then suddenly, the angular intro hammering out, one of his most complex compositions, delivered without preamble. For the solo pieces, Monk sat alone. No trio, just him and the piano. He played Blue Sphere, a spontaneous blues he'd never recorded before. The left hand laid down stride patterns James P. Johnson would have recognized. The right hand played those famous wrong notes made right. It built to a percussive climax, then suspended rhythm entirely for the finish. When Monk stopped, McKibben couldn't help himself. Quiet applause broke the studio silence. Monk played standards next. Nice work if you can get it. My Melancholy Baby. Songs from the American Songbook bent through his oblique harmonic language, then his own compositions. Hackensack. Evidence. Jackieing, written for his niece. Nutty. And finally, Something in Blue. Another blues, simple, direct. The track that would give the album its name. Every note was vintage Monk, percussive, playful, technically perfect. There was no sign of weakness, no indication of decline, just Monk being Monk, which makes what happened next even stranger. Here's what they didn't know in that London studio. Thelonious Monk would never enter a recording studio again. Not as a leader, not as a sideman, not for anyone. The Giants of Jazz tour continued for another year. Monk performed at the Monterey Jazz Festival in September 1972. There were a handful of concerts through 1975. Newport, Carnegie Hall, a few scattered club dates. But by 1973, something irreversible had happened. Monk stopped. He didn't announce it. There was no farewell tour, no press conference, no dramatic statement. He simply withdrew. Moved into the second floor of Baroness Panonica de Königswarter's house in Weehawken, New Jersey. His wife Nellie, exhausted from years of managing his career and mental health crises, couldn't take care of him anymore. Nika, the jazz patroness who had supported Charlie Parker, who had helped Monk get his cabaret card restored, who had been a quiet force in his life for years, gave him a room, a bathroom next to it, a piano upstairs, and there Monk stayed. He would sit in front of the television, sometimes for days, mostly silent. Occasionally he'd walk the grounds, but he didn't play much, didn't compose, didn't perform. The episodes of mania and depression, the cycles that had plagued him since the 1940s, seemed to even out with lithium treatment. But his physical health deteriorated. An enlarged prostate, general exhaustion. Later, strokes would compound everything. People have tried to diagnose what happened. Bipolar disorder, possible frontotemporal dementia, the long-term effects of improper medication, brain damage from years of substance use. The truth is, no one knows for certain. What we do know is that November 15th, 1971 marked a threshold. After that day, the world never heard Thelonious Monk in a studio again. But the album still had to face the world. Black Lion Records released Something in Blue in 1972. No fanfare, no major marketing push. Just a black and white cover. Monk's name. The title. The album appeared in the UK first, then trickled into other markets. In the United States, it was picked up by Audio Fidelity, a budget label known for poorly pressed vinyl. Critics barely noticed. Downbeat reviewed it briefly. The write-up was odd. They said it sounded like Thelonio, the black sheep of the Marx family, comparing Monk to Groucho, Harpo, and Chico's fictional brother. It was meant as a compliment. The album's humor, its playfulness, the way Monk's wrong notes somehow sounded right. But there was no sense of occasion, no recognition that this was a final statement. Jazz fans who bought the album heard something else, though. A musician still at the height of his powers. The trio tracks swung as hard as anything Monk had recorded in 25 years. The solo performances revealed a pianist completely in command of his language. But here's the strange part. While the album was quietly making its way through record bins, Thelonious Monk was already disappearing. The silence was spreading. By the time most listeners discovered Something in Blue, Monk had already stopped performing. The album became a ghost, floating, unnoticed, playing to empty rooms. The silence was sudden, but not dramatic. No scandal, no breakdown captured on stage, no public meltdown, just absence. By mid-1973, Monk had stopped accepting gigs. His son, T.S. Monk, tried to keep the band together for a while. Saxophonist Paul Jeffrey stayed on. But without Thelonious, there was no quartet. The jazz world didn't immediately notice. Monk had always been eccentric. He'd go through periods of withdrawal, then re-emerge. People assumed this was another cycle. But months turned into years. 1974. One concert at Carnegie Hall for the New York Jazz Repertory Company. It was a performance of his music, but reports suggest Monk was barely present. 1975. An appearance at the Newport Jazz Festival in New York. After that, nothing. Monk spent the last 6 years of his life largely in front of a television. Mute for much of the time. Occasionally walking, occasionally sitting at the piano, though rarely playing. His wife Nellie would visit, his children would come. Nika cared for him with devotion. But the man who had revolutionized jazz piano, who had composed 70 of the most important pieces in the American songbook, had stopped making music. On February 17, 1982, Thelonious Monk died from a stroke. He was 64. The obituaries described him as a genius, a pioneer, one of the greatest composers in jazz history. But they also described him as mysterious, eccentric, mad. The narrative that had followed him his entire career, the mad genius trope, calcified into legend. And Something in Blue remained a footnote, barely remembered, until someone went looking for it. For years, Something in Blue was dismissed. It appeared on tiny labels. The vinyl pressings were terrible. It wasn't part of Monk's Blue Note legacy or his celebrated Riverside period. It didn't have the prestige of his Columbia years. It was just there. A footnote. But in the 1980s, something shifted. Mosaic Records, a collector's label specializing in jazz reissues, began working on a project. The Complete Black Lion Sessions. They tracked down the original master tapes from that November 1971 day in London. When they remastered the recordings, critics finally heard what had been there all along. This wasn't a washed-up pianist going through the motions. This was Thelonious Monk at full strength. Pianist and critic Michael Fremer later wrote, "There's nothing weak, indecisive, or washed up about Monk's playing here. He sounds strong, in great humor, and thoroughly engaged, The piano sound is absolutely superb harmonically, texturally, and especially dynamically. It's big, intimate, and close, with the hand separation giving you unusually clear access to Monk's musical thinking. The album revealed something essential. Monk's music hadn't changed. He was still playing the same way he'd played in 1947. The same angular melodies, the same dissonant harmonies, the same percussive attack. But the world's ears had changed. By the 1980s, listeners could hear what Monk had been doing all along. The patterns that seemed random were actually precise. The wrong notes were compositional choices. The silences between phrases weren't hesitation. They were structure. The album's reputation began to grow. Not as a commercial blockbuster, it would never be that, but as an essential document. And its title, Something in Blue, took on new meaning. Blue for sadness, blue for melancholy, blue for the color of endings. The album wasn't just music anymore. It was evidence, proof that Monk hadn't declined, that whatever took him from the piano, it wasn't loss of ability. Which makes the silence afterward even more haunting. Something in Blue influenced jazz in ways that aren't immediately obvious. It's not an album musicians cite as a turning point. It's not a record that launched careers or redefined the genre. But it became a meditation on endings, on what happens when a genius decides, or is forced, to stop. Monk's withdrawal from music haunted those who knew him. How could someone with that much still to say simply, stop? How could the second most recorded jazz composer after Duke Ellington just go silent? The album became a Rorschach test. Some heard triumph, Monk going out strong, proving he still had it. Others heard tragedy, a final glimpse before the curtain fell. Pianists who studied the session heard technique. They noticed how Monk's stride piano on Blue Sphere connected him to James P. Johnson and the Harlem stride tradition. How his harmonic choices on the standards bent familiar songs into new shapes without breaking them. Composers heard construction, the way Monk could take a 12-bar blues and make it feel completely fresh, the way his wrong notes were exactly the right notes in his system. But everyone heard the silence after. Because once Something in Blue was released, there was nothing else. No follow-up, no encore, just 11 years of absence, then death. The album's legacy isn't about influence in the traditional sense. It's about documentation, about preservation, about capturing a moment that turned out to be a last moment. When Mosaic reissued the sessions in the 1990s, jazz scholars began using the album as a teaching tool, not just for Monk's music, but for what happens at the end of a career. What does a master sound like when they know, or sense, that time is running out? On Something in Blue, Thelonious Monk sounds like himself. Completely, unapologetically. And maybe that's the point. Maybe the lesson wasn't in the ending. It was in the refusal to change just because the end was coming. November 15, 1971 was just another session. Alan Bates booked the studio. Monk showed up. Blakey and McKibben played. They recorded for a few hours. Everyone went home. No one knew it was the end of anything. And yet, listening back, there's a weight to it. Not sadness exactly, not resignation, but a kind of completeness. Monk plays the music he'd been playing for decades. The compositions he'd written in the 1940s and 50s. The standards he'd bent into new shapes. The spontaneous blues that revealed his roots. There's no reaching for something new. No attempt to prove anything. No concession to trends or criticism. Just Monk, pure Monk. And maybe that's what the album teaches us. That artistic integrity doesn't require evolution. That mastery can be a sustained note, not a constant climb. That saying the same thing with perfect clarity for 30 years isn't repetition. It's commitment. Monk had taken the single greatest step away from the jazz mainstream in the music's history. He'd created a language so personal that imitating it was impossible. And he'd refused to dilute it, even when it cost him recognition, money, opportunities. Something in Blue captures that refusal in its purest form. It's an album about being yourself so completely that you don't need to explain, don't need to justify, don't need to change. And when the session ended, when Monk stood up from the piano, put on his coat, and walked out of Chappelle Studios, he left behind more than an album. He left a lesson. Sometimes the most radical act is staying true to your vision, even when the world has moved on. Especially when the world has moved on, because the world always circles back eventually. And when it does, the music is still there, waiting, perfect, unchanged, just like Monk knew it would be.